by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A few of you who I've seen this past week have asked me how I enjoyed my trip to Disneyland. We and the rest of our family took a trip down south for the purpose of visiting Disneyland. Mostly I responded, how could anyone not enjoy the happiest place on earth? Especially when seen through the eyes of 2 4-year-olds for the first time. It was great fun. There were a few meltdowns here and there along the way, but I did pull myself back together and continued along. We also had our 11-month-old granddaughter Emma with us, of course, and throughout the 3 days we would occasionally take a turn sitting on a bench with a napping Emma in her stroller. I'm not sure anyone noticed, however, toward the end of the long day, how aggressively Sue and I would compete with each other to volunteer for such a sacrificial sit-down duty. I think in the end we were both saying things like, boy, Emma looks tired. Maybe we should just sit here for a few minutes. On our last day in the park, when the group decided to go on a small world for, I think, the 3rd time, I insisted that I stay with sleeping Emma. It was the least I could do, especially since I had been relentlessly pounded by that song since our first trip around the small world a few days earlier. It was during that brief moment, while sitting there in the shade with Emma, that I noticed a small group of people walking by wearing a Make-A-Wish t-shirt. You know, that amazing foundation that works to grant wishes to children with terminal diseases. And very often those wishes include trips to Disneyland. Last year, the Make-A-Wish Foundation granted over 14,000 wishes. In fact, a trip to Disneyland was the wish of the very first Make-A-Wish child in 1981, after which Walt Disney made wish granting a Disney priority. But sitting there on that bench that day, feeling grateful for our healthy granddaughter, it made me think that not everyone who was at the happiest place on earth was in the middle of the happiest time on earth. Author Anne Lamott, in one of her several thoughtful and insightful books on life, tells of a time that she asked her now sophomore son, Sam, about how he was enjoying the reading of Macbeth. It was an assignment for his English class. He answered honestly. He said, well, I didn't love it. Surprised by this, she pressed for more, and he then added succinctly, I had no idea it would be so tragic. I'm sure those early disciples could have muttered the same exact words sitting there in that upper room or in that small room huddled together trying to make sense of the events of the past few days. Luke's story mentions 3 responses to this amazingly unexpected event that it sort of interrupted their sadness. Something had happened to the body of Jesus. He's not where he's supposed to be. And so it says the women were perplexed. It says that the disciples, when they were told, called it nonsense, actually idle talk. And then Peter, who sees the linen wrappings, goes home amazed. So, bewildered or confused, skeptical, and maybe a little condescending and dismissive, or astounded and speechless. Still today, maybe those responses cover some of the normal, common responses that people still have when confronted with this story, confused, skeptical, amazed, maybe all three at once or all three at different times in your life. But as we move further and further away from that first century story, from that first century Jewish culture, we might add maybe a third possible response, and that might be indifference. I mean, maybe it did exist back then. Maybe I'm thinking among the powerful Roman soldiers and leaders who were too busy running the world or ruling the world, and maybe it just didn't feel very pertinent or important to check out a missing body. I mean, we've got taxes to collect and people to impress, and we're busy. Watching the news this week, as was mentioned earlier, about the bombings in Brussels, I kind of felt a little of that bubble to the surface. As I was preparing to do something and talk on the resurrection, I had to wonder, does this matter? Does this mean anything? Is it relevant? In 1885, George Frederick Watts, English Victorian painter and sculptor, painted a very disturbing portrait of a woman seated on the top of a globe, dressed in rags and a blindfold over her eyes. Her head is bowed low toward a harp she's holding, a musical instrument that had all of its strings broken except for one. The globe she's seated on is engulfed in darkness and gloom and sort of a hazy cloud. Daunting picture of despair. But maybe the most surprising thing about the painting is the title that Watts gave it. It's entitled Hope. Many who have looked at it have wondered if it was painted as some kind of cynical joke or Watt was mocking hope. But one of the details that are very easily overlooked in the painting are these very small, faint, hard to even make out paintings of little musical notations that appear almost sort of floating up to the top of the page, assuming out of the harp. If you're not looking carefully, you'll miss it. You'll miss those little, tiny, faint notes. A subtle indication that for Watts, this was hardly mockery. And that woman whose head is bowed in despair, if you look closely at it, it looks more like she's actually pressing her ear to the instrument, as if straining to hear those quiet, subtle notes coming from that one unbroken string. Maybe what makes hope so hopeful is exactly the time it chooses to show up, or when we need it to show up most. Some say Watts painted that painting shortly after the death of his 1-year-old granddaughter, and that seems about right. Only someone who knew by experience the depth of loss and suffering could possibly paint such a true depiction of the subtlety of hope. Maybe just a few notes coming from a single string that we have to strain to hear is what we really need in those times. I think that's what's needed in Belgium today, with those families today. They don't need a joyful parade. They don't need a bunch of shouts or big bands. They want to just hear a couple of soft notes. Maybe that's what Disneyland did for that Make-A-Wish family I observed. Didn't take away the suffering, but maybe it was just what they needed to hear a little soft music for a minute. It's what we all need at various times in our lives. It's what those 4 women received at the tomb on that first Easter morning. What Peter felt when he saw those grave clothes. Didn't seem like much. Just a hint that maybe it wasn't over, that life might still go on, that there might be another day, there might be something else. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced the painting in one of his sermons called Shattered Dreams. It is said that Nelson Mandela had this painting in the wall of his prison cell on Robben Island for those 18 years that he was there. The resurrection story wasn't front page news. It didn't have a parade attached to it or a gigantic orchestra. It was discreet, restrained, and it was personal. Those quiet notes rising up out of the harp, no effort to overwhelm or intimidate or shout. The loss and the pain was still loss, and it still hurt. The suffering is still acknowledged and respected. Hope isn't a glib, hey, look on the bright side. That's not hope. The story of the resurrection of Jesus became the foundational story for the church. It became the foundational story that brought this band of people together that believe now that the worst things are never the last things. Maybe the church needs to get back to that as their primary job, huh? Maybe back to their primary job, the reason it came into being in the first place, to be a sanctuary, a safe place where people who are afraid and scared and troubled and are facing tragedy, a place where they can come for comfort and solace and encouragement. So often I think the church, and so often throughout history, the church seems to have forgotten its calling to be a place of comfort. And so sometimes people don't seek out the church for comfort. They're afraid if they go, what they'll find isn't comfort, but a scolding. But that wasn't our first calling. Our first calling was to be a safe place, sanctuary for people in need. Church is the place, and could still be the place, where people can come, not to hide from those difficulties or those hard times, where we recognize that it's part of our living. And we don't hide from people who experience them either. We don't shun them or tell them to go to the back of the class, but rather we offer a place to sit among us. And as we wait there in that place for Easter to come. Like those earliest disciples, we stay together, huddle together. It happens when life gets hard. Too often people suffer alone, and they suffer away. The church says, we're here for you. It's supposed to say that. Pressing our ears to the harp, helping others listen for the faint sounds of hope being played on that one string left. 6 days after former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90 in his London home, hundreds of millions of viewers around the globe tuned in on their televisions to watch the largest state funeral the world had ever seen to date. They were saying goodbye to a man who had led his country and the world through the terrible and tragic and frightening realities of the Nazi threat. Gathered inside St. Paul's to celebrate Churchill's extraordinary life were dignitaries of an unprecedented 112 countries, including 6 monarchs, 6 presidents, 16 prime ministers. In addition to the 3,000 that were present in St. Paul's, an estimated audience of 350 million people watched on television, a tenth of the world's population. No one was surprised to hear that Churchill had planned his own funeral, complete with his favorite hymns and scriptures and liturgy. The ending of the service, he asked, as he planned it, he asked that the ending be kept secret until the day. It was a very moving and meaningful service, and then after the benediction, while people were sitting in meditative silence, positioned high in the dome of St. Paul's, a soul bugler began to play taps. Just hearing that tune, we understand that signifies that it's a time to say goodbye, time to say goodnight to someone or something. Represents that there was something coming to an end that day. And in some way for the world, it did mark the end of an era, once ravished by war and trouble and difficulty. After taps was finished, the report said that there was hardly a dry eye in the place. But the big surprise of what Churchill had planned came next. Because right after taps ended, from the other side of the great dome, another bugler started playing the familiar sounds of Reveille. Time to get up. It's time to get up. It's time to get up in the morning. Those who knew the story of Winston Churchill knew how he had lived through many, many dark days and nights in his career or personal life. But he kept leaning forward. He kept pressing his ear to the instrument, listening for sounds of a new day, maybe new possibility, new opportunity. He came to believe through experience that every ending marked the coming of a new beginning. And maybe it's not by accident that we celebrate Easter in the springtime. After a long winter of dead leaves and falling from the trees and plants going dormant comes new growth, new opportunity. Can't always see it when we're in the middle of winter. So we stay together, straining forward to listen. Listen for the quiet music of resurrection hope. That final song caught everyone by surprise in the church. But he wanted his life to proclaim what he had experienced through his whole life. Churchill believed, and the resurrection proclaims that the final sounds of history will not be taps, but Reveille. That's what he believed. And this is what we're saying. This is what the church is proclaiming when it says that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.